Welcome. My name is Samuel Loncar. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Marginalia Review of Books and the director of the Institute for the Meanings of Science. I have the great privilege of working with Philip Ball as our research director of the New Biology Project, which is based on Ball's work, How Life Works, A User's Guide to the New Biology, published by the University of Chicago Press. The New Biology Project brings together a working group of leading scientists, scholars, and industry leaders coming together to advance the new scientific vision of life revealed by modern biology and synthesized in Ball's book. We've had the privilege to have two conversations so far with biologists, starting with Sir Paul Nurse, the director of the Francis Crick Institute in London, and then Naomi Morris, the director of the Morris Lab at the Crick Institute. This is our first time we have the privilege of talking to a distinguished philosopher of biology, Daniel Nicholson, who is an assistant professor of the philosophy of science at George Mason University and one of the world's top authorities in the philosophy of biology, and particularly the relationship between the mechanistic paradigm and the new organicist paradigm. So I want to start by welcoming you, Dan. Thank you so much, and Phil, for being with us. So in terms of the context of this conversation, Professor Nicholson's work is doing something very significant. He ends the last section of the conclusion of one of his articles discussing the fact that the mechanistic paradigm, which we'll discuss in detail, has been identified by many leading scientists, not least the great biologist Jacques Monod, with the scientific method itself. And therefore, the critique of the mechanistic paradigm represents not just a change in biology, and not just a change in conventional understandings, perhaps, of the neo-Darwinian evolutionary synthesis, but actually a change in our interpretation of the scientific revolution itself. And this is part of the great privilege of being able to discuss this with Professor Nicholson and with Philip Ball, who in his work brings to light the extraordinary amount of data that shows that a machine metaphor for what's going on in life simply isn't the best metaphor anymore. But that raises deep questions about why this metaphor has become so influential and why it is so hard to pry, you could say, apart from some of its legitimate uses, which Professor Nicholson and Dr. Ball are very careful to illuminate, and yet also from the way in which it can actually impede current progress in biology and more broadly in the understanding of science as providing causal explanations. So Phil, with that said, could you start us off by talking about the significance for you in How Life Works of the problem with the machine metaphor? And maybe then you can direct your questions based on that to Professor Nicholson.
Okay, thanks, Samuel. Yes, I think it's very relevant to say that I didn't begin the book, but I came to biology quite happy with the idea of a machine metaphor. I long ago was a chemist by training, and the notion that as a chemist I'd received about the way biology works is that we can think of biology's molecules as lots of little machines that have very well specified tasks, and they're all interacting with one another in very specific ways that somehow collaborate to define well-established lines of information and energy transfer and information transfer, and out of this comes us. So, this seemed to me to make a lot of sense until I started finding really aspects of biology that have, I think, only started to really emerge in the past 2 or 3 decades that don't really seem to fit this idea. And the more I thought about it and the more I looked into it, the harder it seemed to sustain that old notion. So I feel like I was kind of forced into questioning this paradigm. I had no preconceptions about it initially.
You weren't a crypto vitalist.
And well, you see, no, I exactly that. And I'm really interested to know whether how Dan approached this from his perspective. But I wondered whether, first of all, I wanted to suggest to Dan whether whether the description that I have just given is actually a fair one. That I guess I would express it as the idea that we are machines, full of smaller machines, programmed by our genome, and that we can be understood in these purely mechanistic and perhaps computational terms. That seems to me to be pretty much the the image of life that many biologists seem to be working with, even if they don't articulate it quite as explicitly as that. So, Dan, I wondered whether you think that's a fair way of putting it.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It is the sort of orthodox view. In fact, it's so common that it just is not part of the conversation, or it wasn't until very recently, precisely because it was such a dominant view. There was no reason to talk about it.
Mhm.
That's so when I got interested in it, I was kind of surprised at the fact there was so little had been written about this. There were some people, of course, in the margins saying for a long time. I mean, for as long as the machine metaphor has been used in biology, there have been critics. So that history goes all the way back to Descartes, to the 17th century. But yeah, it is the case that it's just something that you just learn, you just pick up, and it's just a general assumption. And if you take that as a given, a lot of things follow and a lot of things make sense. It provides a very comforting conceptual framework in which you can interpret data and make sense of what you're learning about the world. So yeah, I think that's right. And I'm so excited that there is now an increasing appetite to have these conversations. It just shows that more and more people are not quite as comfortable as they used to be with this very familiar way of thinking about life.
Hmm. Now you say that this conventional idea is just taken for granted to the point that it's more or less invisible until you
Yeah.
start to see it there. But there doesn't seem to be anything inevitable about it. If we go right back to Plato and Aristotle and the ancient Greek philosophers, they certainly didn't envisage life in these sorts of terms. So I wonder if you could say something about how it came to be that this concept of life became so pervasive.
So I really think that the key word that you used there, Phil, inevitable, is that it's not inevitable is super important here. And I think that's why people should care about history, right? Even if you have no interest in the past and you care about the present, what history gives you is the recognition that the way we think about things today is contingent and could be otherwise, and it's not inevitable. So learning about the history of science is learning about how other choices are possible, right? And so it emancipates you from the inevitability of the present. And I think that the history of thinking about life really reflects that, right? So yes, if you look at antiquity, there are some allusions to dolls and humans in some of Aristotle's works, but there's nothing like an analogy that serves to ground the inquiry into life until the early modern period, until the scientific revolution. And as Samuel intimated, I mean, the very idea of modern science becomes coupled with the reconceptualization of nature as a giant piece of clockwork, right? You can't tell the history of the scientific revolution without recognizing that it entailed a reconceptualization of how we think about nature and everything in it, including organisms, right? So if you want to track the history of machine thinking in biology, I think you need to go back to Rene Descartes, although there, of course, Descartes was drawing on earlier some earlier thinkers that we can also mention. But the important thing is that for Descartes, the machine model is a model of intelligibility. He thinks it's not just simply useful to regard organisms and machines, it's necessary because that machine model gives us epistemic traction, as philosophers say. That it gives us a way of understanding what's going on, right? It also gives you it sets the standards of what constitutes an acceptable explanation, right? What is acceptable is that which can be explained mechanistically. And so that's how the idea of mechanistic explanations becomes synonymous with scientific explanation, where we just go around the world looking for mechanisms and trying to identify these mechanisms. And we just assume that that the world is made up of mechanisms. That has not been, never was obviously conclusively proved. That's just something that we assume as a point of departure for us to do science, right? And that happens in a very general way in the early modern period. And what's really remarkable is that in the 20th century, you've got this sort of rupture in the sciences, right? So physics undergoes this massive revolution or revolutions at the beginning of the 20th century, which leads to the sort of the collapse of the traditional mechanistic or mechanicist sort of framework and with it a collapse of determinism and arguably also reductionism. And yet that model becomes even more important to modern biology. Not only does it not collapse. Not only does it survive, but it becomes invigorated by molecular biology. So, it's a very, very strange state of affairs that by the late 20th century, physicists have learned to unthink, to not see the world anymore as a machine, while biologists and arguably also psychologists and neuroscientists who think about the brain have become more mechanist than ever, right? And so, yeah, you could really tell the history of biology as the history of the success of the machine metaphor. And one reason for this is that the machine metaphor is super versatile because it can draw on many different kinds of machines. And as technology has developed over the centuries, biologists have had new models to draw upon, right? So for Descartes, it was clocks and also, the sort of moving fountains that he saw in the gardens in France, and then by the 18th century, Lavoisier starts making the analogy with steam engines and starts thinking about combustion and respiration in terms of energy and matter and regulation. By the 19th century, you've got industrialization and the notion of a factory that then is used to understand division of labor and assembly lines, right, at the cellular level. And then with the 20th century, you've got the development of the computer and cybernetics and information theory, right? So it's just it's the gift that gives on giving. I mean, it's an incredibly fruitful resource to use when you're dealing with something as complex as life. Why we are intimidated by life's complexity. And so what scientists do is we draw on that which we do know and we do understand, like machines, and we use that as a model or as a prism to see to understand that which we don't understand, right? So these metaphorical redescriptions, which for a long time philosophers were very suspicious of. They thought that metaphors, couldn't possibly play a prominent role in science. They're just literary devices, ornaments of language. That's of course completely changed. We'd be hard pressed to find a philosopher who doesn't recognize that scientific discovery is a process of metaphorical redescriptions. So metaphors are everywhere. It's not a matter of giving up on metaphors. It's a matter of understanding what role these metaphors are playing and when do they outlive their usefulness, if they do.
I want to come back to metaphors in a bit. I wonder also whether the rise of this mechanistic way of thinking about life was also so strong because it set itself against the alternatives, and in particular the alternative that Samuel mentioned earlier on of vitalism. So, alongside this notion, this Cartesian notion of organisms as a machine, was for a long time this pervasive idea that living things seemed to be qualitatively different from rocks and stones and even steam engines in that they were alive, and we didn't know what that life consisted of. And the notion was there was some mysterious life force, the vital life force that distinguished them. That was an idea that fell by the wayside in the 19th century. And I have the sense even today that there's an anxiety actually in biology that this idea might raise its head again, this sort of slightly mystical idea that there's something special and strange and almost ineffable about life. Do you think that's the case?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think there's so much to say about vitalism. I think it's a term that has not been kind. We've really not been kind to it historically. It is a much Vitalism as a school of thought is much richer than traditional historical accounts give it credit for. Basically everybody who disagreed with that mechanization of life, was sort of classed under that camp. Of course, the terms were used retrospectively. Of course, in the 18th century, the term vitalism starts to be used, and for a long time, to be a vitalist was just to be someone who was not satisfied with that reduction of the biological to the mechanical, and who thought that something else was needed to be introduced into the explanation, or something different. You can either say, well, it's a machine, but with a governor, someone running the machine, or it's just the whole notion of machine makes no sense, period, and we need a different way of understanding. And so a lot of the ideas that have helped, are now helping us overcome the mechanistic tradition, or the mechanistic, paradigm, are ideas that were developed by the so-called vitalist school, right? And so we should be a little bit careful about not simplifying too much, right? It is absolutely true that some of them did believe that there were these forces, right, that could not be explained. But think about it. I mean, if the dominant view is mechanicism, and that is what, and that becomes synonymous with science, then any alternative is going to be, by definition, non-scientific, right? And that's a bit unfair. If you want to bring something to the table in a conversation, say, well, if you don't agree with me, then you're not doing science, period, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if you think about it that way, the history becomes a little bit more interesting. It's not just a matter of scientists and pseudoscientists and the mechanists or the scientists that thankfully won. It's a history of people disagreeing about the ontology of living systems, the nature of living systems, a disagreement that has all kinds of implications for how we do science and implications for the legitimacy of reductionism and other things that follow from that, right? And just as in mechanism, it's a long history with different incarnations, different generations. In Vitalism, you've got the same thing, right? You've got people in the 17th century, you got George Ernst Stahl proposing that there's an anima, some sort of Aristotelian soul, right, that is responsible for animating life. It's sort of an animistic vitalism. But then in the 18th century and 19th century, you got very different vitalistic theories, right? There are people either suggesting that, a lot of people thinking that they were being good Newtonians because what Newton had done, as he explained in the optics, is in proposing gravity, is to say, look, I'm not going to explain the origin of this force. I'm just going to account for the phenomena. I'm going to give you this equation, this principle that allows you to predict so the operation of this force. And if you ask me what is gravity, I'll just say that's not a scientific question. Many biologists were very much inspired by that, Newton being the great scientist, right? And in the 18th century, that's why you have this rise of vitalistic, a proliferation of vitalistic theories by people constantly citing Newton in their embryological and physiological work, saying, look, I'm just doing what the great man did. I'm observing natural phenomena. I'm not able to explain everything in terms of matter and motion, just that like Newton could not explain everything in terms of matter and motion. So I'm appealing to these forces that I cannot tell you their origin, but I can describe their operation in terms of, say, an embryo development, right? Developing over time. So yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to say the vitalists got it right, but if you look at the history, it's a much more interesting history where you got that debate, and then, as you said, by the mid 19th century or so, there's this rise of experimental physics-inspired approaches to physiology, especially in Germany, that then spreads. And by that time, sort of vitalism it's not that it was ever conclusively refuted, it just stops being a useful hypothesis. And then in the 20th century, you've got a couple of people like Hans Driesch and Henry Bergson in very different contexts, sort of trying to rehabilitate vitalism, neo-vitalism, at a time when there was absolutely no appetite for that. And that's why those ideas were never really picked up. So, so the history is it's really quite much more interesting. Yeah.
Well, I think the phase that it moved on from after vitalism was considered to be discredited by, the work of people like Friedrich Wöhler and Louis Pasteur, chemistry really, chemists showing that actually the components, things like proteins of living things, are things that we can understand from a physical and chemical point of view. So that was kind of, the end of vitalism. There was no difference in fundamental substance. But then,
Phil, just very, very quick footnote here. Even Wöhler himself was, even though he's recognized for having synthesized urea, and that's sometimes talked about as the death knell of vitalism, he defended vitalistic ideas in the context of embryology. In fact, much of the history of animal chemistry, as it was known in the 19th century, is a history of people like Justus Liebig, who were in some ways, in some domains of biology, still vitalists. So what's really kind of interesting is that even if you look at the history of biochemistry, you got the sort of the restriction of the vitalist force, to some areas. Now, we don't think anymore that we're made up of stuff that is any different, and yet the vital force sort of refused to die. Just that even if you look at those milestones in the history of the supposed death of vitalism, you've got a more complex story underneath.
Well, that's exactly the story that I think is really interesting in the late 19th and earlier 20th century, where people would say, okay, there is no need, no cause, no evidence to invoke some mysterious force. But nevertheless, some people said, and particularly embryologists would say that there is something special about living matter that we're not going to get at, we're not going to understand by a purely mechanistic and reductive approach that is, taking it apart into its components. There is something special about the whole. So this was I think you mentioned it earlier, Dan, the organicist idea. That is something that I think remains relevant today and is actually becoming more relevant today. So I wondered if you could say a bit about what that consisted of. If we don't have vitalism, what is special about living organisms?
Yeah, so I think that, okay, so just to say, the organicists is basically a bunch of people in the early 20th century who were dissatisfied with both mechanism and vitalism. They felt that the mechanistic reduction in physiology had gone too far. We're talking, the turn of the 20th century, but we're also appalled by the proposals of Driesch, the positive proposals. So they were united in their rejection of Driesch, although also united by the recognition that Driesch was right to criticize the machine metaphor, which is also very interesting. If you read Driesch, most people don't. If you read Driesch, what you find is that some of his so-called proofs of vitalism, as he calls them in the Science and Philosophy of the Organism, these lectures that he gave in Scotland in 1914, are actually proofs for why we should not think about the embryo as a machine. Actually, they're proofs for why embryos are not machines, which is kind of interesting, right? So many people think, okay, he's onto something, as most vitalists have been, in wanting to reject this way of thinking about what an organism is, but he's absolutely wrong in sort of proposing these forces that don't seem to be really explanatory. They're just another name for the problem. They're not explaining. They're just describing the problem using a term that doesn't really help us, right? And so there you have then in different places at the same time the development of a new school of thought that positions itself sort of as a third way, as a middle way, as a way, an approach to life that brings the best of both worlds. The commitment to the experimental method, to experimenting and of course experimentally reducing complexity as much as possible, and the adequacy of physical chemical explanations for some phenomena in life, but at the same time wants to argue for the autonomy of biology, right, which has always been an important sort of motivation for the vitalist. I mean, biology itself was coined in the context of that vitalist debate by people who felt that the science of life needed to be different. It could not be reduced to chemistry because life is different, right? So you got people saying, well, we need a theoretical biology. This is at a time when theoretical physics is exploding, right? Early 20th century. And you got this explicit analogy being drawn. Like, you can't just continue to build, you can't have a science that is built only on data. We're drowning in data, they're saying, in a way that is kind of reminiscent of how today a lot of molecular biologists are also complaining about that. We need theory, okay? And we need a theory of what the organism is, a theory that accounts for the characteristics of organisms, that does not reduce them to automata, right? That reckons with their agency, with the fact that they seem to be purposive, right? That they are flexible and plastic and self-organizing and self-maintaining, and so you got those ideas which develop, and so that's what the organicist school is. It's a bunch of people in Britain. You have E.S. Russell and John Scott Haldane. This is the earlier generation, and then the later generation, Joseph Needham, of course, well-known biochemist, then became a world-renowned historian of Chinese civilization, Waddington, and J.H. Woodger, right? And then in Vienna, Austria, you have Bertel Amphi, known for general systems theory, Paul Weiss, super important cell biologist that later emigrated to America, and William Emerson Ritter. There are people in different places a bit earlier as well. And so, yeah, that's kind of an interesting sort of fact. If you look at the history of this debate, in the early 20th century, you got this group of people who are very excited about developing a new philosophy of biology that is explicitly non-mechanistic and non-vitalistic, okay, and that that tries to protect the autonomy of biology in a way, recognizes the distinctness of life, but in a naturalistic way, in a way that is not offensive, okay, to the sensibilities of most scientists. And I think that it is actually helpful this might be a little bit controversial to say, but I think it is actually helpful to think of organicism as a form of naturalized vitalism, right? Because the criticisms are the same. It's just that the proposited proposals are different. But they're talking about self-organization instead of talking about some sort of vis essentialist or Lebenskraft or entelechy. So I think in that sense, we can understand the history a bit better. And so it's a kind of a very exciting time. And unfortunately, this organicist movement never really precipitated that revolution that they thought was inevitable in biology. They thought that biology would follow physics, and that physics had already shown us that we need to emancipate ourselves from the shackles of Victorian mechanism and determinism. And it didn't happen for a number of reasons. What we ended up having in biology is molecular biology, which was, if anything, a vindication of those 19th century ideas of reductionism and determinism, with a little bit of information theory and cybernetics thrown in for good measure. So that's, I think, and that's why sort of these organicist thinkers are not as well known today as they should be. They've sort of, they've kind of disappeared from sight. And again, it's exciting to see more people taking an interest in reading these people.
Well, I mean, as you say, the reductionist mechanistic view triumphed, and one reason I'd suggest for that was Crick and Watson and DNA. That the key problem throughout the 20th century was, as you've mentioned, was where does this organization in living systems come from? They are these fantastically complex systems that somehow maintain integrity. For years and years and years, this kind of collaboration of many different molecules. How does that happen? And that was the central problem until DNA. So, finally in 1953, we started to see how it could be, or this is the conventional idea that this organization comes about. It comes about because there is a program, there is information that encodes it all. An idea that, I mean, you've written a lot about this, an idea that we can find expressed very explicitly in Erwin Schrödinger's book, What is Life, 1944, and then seemingly vindicated by the structure of DNA.
Yep.
So do you think that that's really the reason that gave us an apparent solution to this problem of organization?
I think that's right. And I think it's kind of a bit tragic to read what the organicists have to say about the link between genetics and embryology. So a lot of them try to reckon with this problem of the origin of organization, as you put it, Phil, and write at length about this. And it's just so interesting to see it with the benefit of hindsight, like E.S. Russell or John Scott Haldane talking about how it is nonsensical, I mean, philosophically speaking, to assume that a part of a whole can determine a whole. You can take, which is of course what we now know to be the case with genetics. I mean, and so you got a lot of claims about how we should think about the gene as a sort of a nominal concept that does not refer in the way that Mendel actually thought about. And so that's kind of interesting too, because now we're arriving at that notion again that the genes don't really refer to anything specific because of the lack of correlation between genotype, direct one-on-one correlation between genotype and phenotype. But yeah, and so they developed these arguments for why the chromosome theory of inheritance was kind of impossible, not only implausible but impossible. Of course, that was proven wrong by the spectacular successes of molecular biology and the discovery of the structure of DNA. And yes, I mean, I'm sure that if we had been there being scientists at the time, we would have all been carried by that wave of excitement of what was to come. And it sort of makes sense, right? That for a long time, there was no need to even ask those questions anymore because we just had an agenda and we had a way, we just needed more data. We needed to fill out that picture of how, as you put it, there's a genetic program. There's software that we know if we can decipher it and we know the initial conditions, ultimately we can potentially compute the embryo and make sense of it in a way that Schrödinger himself had already suggested, mentioning Laplace's demon in his What is Life book. So yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's a mechanistic research program that is very successful in the sense that it generates a lot of data about the constitution of cells and embryos, of course, and development. The question is whether that is the whole story. There was this in many areas at the end of the 20th century, this sort of idea of the end of science, right? That there's this book that was published called The End of Science, John Horgan, were basically arguing that most science, most discoveries had already been done, and we just need to fill out the details, right? As long as the human genome is sequenced, cancer and all diseases will be a thing of the past. We'll be able to read the book of life and basically finish biology, And so, of course, when that didn't happen, that's been one of the reasons why there's been a renewed interest in alternative ideas.
Mm. And I'd like to delve a bit into why that didn't happen, because it seemed then, and still to many people seems like an entirely plausible idea, that it might have happened, that it might have been that we were simply a readout of this information in our genes, because clearly the genome does hold information. It's information that is inherited and passed on to future generations. It seems to create a plausible picture. That information gives rise to proteins. The idea was that they're programmed to do particular biochemical tasks that, amongst themselves will result in putting together cells and us. It also seems clear that the information in genes does clearly have an influence, a very strong influence on the phenotype, on our traits. A dog genome is never going to give rise to a horse, for example. And we can see, with more and more genetic data, we can see clear correlations between what's in the genome, the variants of our genes, and different traits. So why didn't that what has sort of gone wrong with that picture? Why have we not, having now carried out the Human Genome Project and decoded the information in the genome, why haven't we got there? Why haven't we got an explanation
Great
for
question.
that?
It's a great question for that, and I think it's not always appreciated what you said, which is that these are claims that are empirically accountable. Okay, they could be true, or they could have been true. It's not you don't have it's not just a philosophical sort of dispute, right? So the idea of life being the product of the execution of a set of algorithmic instructions is something that could have been borne out by the data. It just turns out that there are increasing reasons to suspect that that's not quite right. Why isn't it quite right? Because for many reasons. I mean, we've overemphasized the explanatory power, the causal power of genes, for one thing, right? So genes, of course, do code for proteins, although more specific, the sequence of nucleotides codes for the amino acid sequence of polypeptide chains. But to go from there to the idea that we can work out on the basis of genetic constitution what the cell is going to do at any given moment, or let alone development, I think it's a totally different claim, and it's one that is not borne out by what we now know to happen, right? The really interesting thing when you think about what DNA brings to the table is, you could even argue that it brings something that wasn't there, which is a form of Aristotelian formal cause. I mean, information as a notion is something arguably new. And in fact, when you look at what molecular biologists have to say about why what they're doing is different from good old biochemistry or genetics, information is the concept that keeps coming up, right? These people think that they're doing something new from the 1950s onwards because they're no longer interested in just working out the details of the biochemical details of transformations of energy and kinetics and all of that. They care instead about working out how a message information is being transcribed and translated and executed. Okay, so the whole program of what it is that you're doing as a scientist changes. And so in that sense, it is not paradoxically not completely materialistically a materialistic notion, right? This notion of information is complicates the picture a little bit philosophically. But the reason why the causal story is more complex is because genes, DNA, the hereditary substance, as Schrödinger called it, is always placed in an environment that is already organized, that already has an architecture and an organization, spatial and temporal. And so what the genes what the DNA is able to do is only by virtue of the fact that you've got all these other macromolecules that are giving meaning, if you want to use that term, to the message. Okay, so one problem was that for a long time there were these assumptions that genes were sort of self-executing. There was this sort of sometimes referred to as genetic animism. The genes are able to start to initiate development or regulate it or conduct development and all of that. You've got this language of master controlling genes and all of that, which of course is getting the causation backwards, because when you look at what's going on in the cell or in the embryo, you always have a pre-existing organization without which DNA does absolutely nothing. DNA, as Phil will be able to say much more expertly than me, chemically speaking, is an inert molecule. It has to be, so that it can preserve the so-called message that it contains. It only becomes interesting biologically when it is placed in the cellular milieu, right? And so I think that what happened in the molecular biology revolution is that we just sort of took that context for granted and sometimes forgot about it and assumed that all we need to do is just work out how far we can get in terms of understanding the cell and development. And it turns out, I mean, even proteins can't fully be, you can't really understand protein function, let alone cellular organization, by looking only at DNA.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that is one of the key examples I always give, that we can, the notion is that, okay, well, at least one thing we can say about what DNA is kind of encoding, the information in there, is that it's encoding the structure of the respective proteins. And there's, a lot of truth in that. But even in that case, many of our proteins, in fact, most of our proteins can be put together using the same DNA sequence in many different ways, in several different ways. And that does tend to happen in different tissues. So it's the same gene, the same genetic information being used to make different proteins that might have quite different functions in different tissues, which can only happen when there is information coming from other sources, from higher levels. Even at the level of determining protein structure, it's not all coming from the genes. And the other issue is that, the old idea of the genome was that we have these genes, they encode proteins, and then there's a load of other stuff. Pretty much, all of it is just junk that's accumulated there through evolution. Then things got more sophisticated in the 1960s, and we realized, well, some of that stuff that's not encoding proteins is actually sort of like switches that are regulating the genes, turning them on and off. Okay, so there's some of that too. It now seems that a fair proportion of what is in the genome is stuff that is used to make molecules almost speculatively, molecules that might do something, certainly don't do anything by themselves. Some of the things like microproteins that are just too small really to do anything by themselves, or tiny little bits of RNA that don't get translated into protein, that again, they're small, but they have regulatory functions collectively. So it's impossible to look at one of these bits of a product of the genome and say, well, this is for this function or that function. It is almost put out there because it might find functions in combination with everything else. So it's a very complex picture, a very complex causal picture, but also a complex picture in terms of what that information is actually about.
Yeah.
So I think, that's also the reason. And this is really something that we've only really got to grips with properly in the past two or three decades. So, that I think is for me, that was part of the reason that made me think, well, actually, even the genome, even the information in the genome we can't think about functionality in the ways that we used to.
It pushes against notions of design and efficiency. It doesn't seem like a very efficient system when you've got all these, molecules going about, and you just rely probabilistically that something will happen when it needs to happen. It really is a picture, if you zoom out a bit, that looks very un-machine-like, okay?
Yes. Yeah.
The machine, you design it so that it does something for you as efficiently as possible, right? The shortest line between 2 points is a straight line. That's not what you find when you look at what's going on inside the cell. But as many people have said, I mean, what you lose in terms of efficiency, it's very costly energetically for the cell to do what it does. You gain in terms of plasticity. It makes the cell infinitely more dynamic and resilient and adaptable than any machine could possibly be, precisely because it does not operate deterministically like a piece of clockwork. Instead, it makes it presents conditions to allow certain things to happen, statistically speaking. And so in that sense, we're going back to the beginning of the conversation, where you got a picture which is just very different from that machine view. It is not a picture of the cell as a piece of clockwork. Instead, it's a very curious self-organizing system maintained far from equilibrium, where a lot of things are constantly happening, and you don't know if they're going to lead to anything that is meaningful or functional, right? Where you can no longer infer function from structure. I mean, I think that's the big lesson of what happened to proteins, right? Proteins were always considered to be the sort of soldiers of the cells, the molecules that do the stuff that matters. Proteins themselves do things by virtue, not only or even not primarily of their amino acid sequence, instead by virtue of how the temperature and the pH and salinity and all that, the environment in which they are folding, that will affect their structure. The substrates that they happen to bind to when they're roaming the cell, that will also determine what they do, when they're expressed and where they're expressed. And so that's why got all this language of moonlighting proteins doing other jobs when no one's looking, right? And the very idea that we call that moonlighting is already very telling, because we just assume that proteins should have a function. We often name them by virtue of their function that we think they do.
So it's like they're misbehaving, right? They're moonlighting. They're doing things they shouldn't do.
They're misbehaving because we've got that mechanistic mindset. Because if we didn't think mechanistically, we wouldn't think that they're misbehaving, and we wouldn't be surprised. That's the thing that I find most interesting, is that once we give up this assumption, things that were previously thought to be super weird and strange and anomalous become almost expected. The fact that proteins can adopt different conformations because they'll have a very sort of smooth energy landscape, which will allow them to sort of easily transition from one structure to another structure. And you've got all these metamorphic proteins, and intrinsically disordered proteins that often have domains, or the whole thing just refuses to fold in a way that is functional, and only does that when in the context of a binding event, right? Which means that what matters is context rather than sequence. Okay, so if you look at the history of how we thought about proteins, this notion of a molecular machine was super important, right? Because to think about protein complexes, say, as machines, it sort of vindicated certain assumptions that we may have about structure and also about specificity, right? The assumption about structure is that if you understand the structure, you're going to be able to work out the function. And that's how we think about machines, right? Mechanical machines, at least. You can identify the structure, you should be able to know what it does, atemporally, by the way, without worrying about time. So you reduce the temporal dimension conveniently, right? And specificity is the other thing. Machines are designed to do one thing. And so you expect proteins to do, or protein complexes or other assemblies to do one thing. When they do different things, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's just that, the language that we've used, the concepts, the metaphors that we've used have sort of prevented us from either seeing the evidence that did not fit, or taking it, or if we saw it, not taking it seriously for a long time.
There's another consideration in all of this I want to bring in as well, that another reason that we didn't see this for a long time is that for perfectly good reasons, we began looking at the simpler systems first. We looked at bacteria. What's really striking to me is that these notions we've talked about of things like protein disorder, of alternative splicing of proteins, of complex regulatory functions, all of those become more prevalent as the organism gets more complex. So, actually bacteria, the sort of machine idea works somewhat better for bacteria. We can think, we can assign particular proteins, particular roles more easily in bacteria. If we go all the way to viruses, they're really stripped down. They don't have any of this junk. They're really simple, they're and on the borderline of what we consider living in any event. So the more complex an organism gets, it seems, the more, people, some people will say, well, that's just because they're messier. And so, there's more contingency in their evolution. But it doesn't seem to be that's really what's happening. If they were just getting messier, they would work less and less well. This seems to be there, if you like, by design, to use that dangerous word, by design. Through evolution has found this is the way to create more complex organisms with many different tissues. And in particular, so this is where I'm leading to, in particular, organisms that seem to have more facility for exercising agency. Bacteria don't have a great deal because they tend to stay in one environment. They have some, but they tend to stay in one environment. If they go out of that, they die. We go into all sorts of environments because we have an agency that allows us to do that. So it seems to me that these changes in the way things are happening at the molecular level seems to have some relation to the agentic nature of the organisms themselves. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit about this notion of agency. It's one that is controversial in biology. There are plenty of biologists who feel extremely uneasy to see it introduced at all. But it does seem to be, it seems to me, to be one that not just that we can recognize in living things, but that is an essential aspect of what it means for something to be alive. What's your view on that, Dan?
My view is that the reason why, I think that we can explain why it is that agency is sort of not a very polite word to use in conversation among scientists. And it has to do with the legacy of the machine metaphor as well, right? If we assume, not even make the case for it, but we just assume and accept that everything is ultimately mechanical, because that's how our only conception of what it means to do science is to do, to investigate mechanical entities or machines, then the question of agency just never comes up, because machines are not agents, or at least conventional machines. Most machines, I think you can make it uncontroversial case to say that they're not acting on their own behalf. They are passive. They behave. They are reactive rather than being active. And so, if one needed another motivation for giving up this machine view, is another reason is that it allows you to look at organisms in a way that is in a way less constrained. If what your eyes are telling you is that this entity is able to compensate against perturbations, that is acting purposively towards accomplishing a goal, that it does things, it changes its environment, that it can't help but act as an agent, then we should just take that seriously. I mean, if we're good empiricists, we care about doing justice to the phenomena. We're going to try to explain it and account for it instead of being embarrassed by it. And say, well, if you accept that E. coli are agents, then we can't do science anymore. That's the end. So we have to keep pushing the old view, maybe stretch the metaphor as far as we can beyond breaking point, so that we can account for all of the stuff that we are learning about the phenomena that we study. And so I think that's one. I think that is in my opinion, the reason why agency is such a controversial notion. But as you point out, Phil, I think it's kind of difficult to do without it. I mean, the way I like to think about this is, if you stop someone in the street and you ask them, like, tell me, how would you think, what is life? I mean, how would you characterize the things that how organisms behave? You're going to get descriptions from the lay public which are laced with agency. Organisms do things. So you got this sort of commonsensical understanding of life as agential, and yet you go and you look at the scientific literature and there's nothing about that in the literature. It's almost like we have filtered out all of that, which we know to be obvious from our experience of other life forms, let alone our experience of ourselves, so that we can do science. And I think that's what we need to break free from, to recognize that we need a theory of agency. We need at least an understanding of what agency is, that is naturalistic and scientific, and that is not controversial. The fact that we don't have that in 2025 is, again, I think, a really good sign of the sort of the legacy of this machine thinking, where we just assume we never needed it. And so again, the fact that more and more people feel that we need an account of agency is, to me, a sign that more and more people are prepared to not completely accept unreservedly the machine view, because to be an agent is in a way to act with purpose. So that's another term that needs to be sort of naturalized and made unoffensive. What is purposiveness, and what entities in the world exhibit purposiveness? But I think that, in my opinion, I think that one way to approach this is to mention things or invoke scientific findings or scientific facts that few scientists would have any issue with. So what I like to do is to invoke physics and thermodynamics. No one's going to deny that physics is questionable, right? So what does physics tell you about cells? Well, it tells you lots of interesting things. Thermodynamics tells you lots of interesting things about cells. It tells you that cells are processes; they're not things. It gives you a sort of a vindication of a processual understanding of life, because it tells you that the constitution of these living entities is maintained dynamically by the constant turnover of its material components, right? It tells you that to be alive is to be far from equilibrium. To be alive is to resist the tendencies of entropy and of the return to an equilibrium condition where there's no movement, right? And so one can make a case that agency, in its most minimal, simplest sense, is coming from the fact that you've got these natural entities in the world that are doing things that they have to act in order to stay in existence, right? They have to, if you're an organism, you have to eat and bring in energy from the environment and matter to maintain yourself. If you don't do that, if you stop doing that, you stop existing. So if you understand life itself as a process of maintaining yourself far from equilibrium, that's maybe is a way of beginning the conversation. Not by all means is not the end of it, and it's still a lot of work needs to be done to explain exactly what agency is. But at least we have the beginning of a conversation where we are talking about things that are not controversial, and that allow us to want to see in the horizon what that picture may look like, right? A picture where agency is important.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dan, you said it's something that you won't find in the conventional biological literature, and I know exactly what you mean by that. What's interesting to me is that actually you find it everywhere, but it's cryptic. The language that is used is so strikingly agential that it seems to me it's almost a kind of recognition that we can't do without this problem. We'll use these terms and we'll say, oh, they're just metaphorical, but actually they are there doing work.
Yes.
So, it's routine for people, for example, to talk about a protein recruiting other molecules. What is that about? How is that going on? It's, it's routine to talk about things like signaling, that it's all about sort of transmitting information, and probably most notoriously to think about genes as being selfish, self-replicating entities that are acting on their own behalf. Not on behalf of the organism, but for themselves. And in the traditional sort of selfish gene view, those genes are so clearly agents competing in this undifferentiated pool of other genes for dominance. So I think in a way that's the kind of tell for me that biology simply cannot get away from agential language, and saying, oh, we're just using it in an as if sense.
Yeah.
Won't do, because if it really was that, you should be able to get rid of it, but you never can. And I wonder whether this might bring us, particularly talking about the selfish gene, whether this might bring us on to the question of what these considerations mean for evolution, which is something I've been nervous about getting too far into, because I think it's a really complex question. But you've thought about this more than I have, and I'd be very interested to know what you feel about that. That once if we recognize that organisms have agency, that they're not simply vehicles acting on behalf of their quasi-agential genes. Does this mean we have to take a different view of evolutionary theory from the traditional one?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that this discussion is being picked up now increasingly by evolutionary biologists, which is not obvious. You might think that this is a question for for biologists looking at individual organisms. But I just want to say one quick thing before we move on to evolution about ascribing agency to genes in the way that Dawkins famously did and others. I mean, one thing is to recognize agency in the living world. Another thing is to say that everything is agential. I would not want to go as far as to I do not think that the second claim is quite right. I think that to be an agent, you need to have certain organizational dynamics that allows you to act in an agential way, to be an agent. If we are to talk about proteins or genes being agents, I think that what often is happening there, if you look, I mean, at least that's Paul Weiss said this, and I think he was right. I mean, he was talking about this in the 1960s, is that you are sort of projecting onto the part abilities of the whole. Paul Weiss used to say that we often talk about the molecular control of cellular activity when we should talk about the cellular control of molecular activity. Right, and so I think that's often happens, and you know, we talk about organizers and all this language to the molecules. So I think that needs to be treated with caution. I think that to be an agent is to exhibit a certain causal regime of self-organization, and so that's why I would say we should perhaps restrict the notion of agency to organisms or cells, living entities themselves. Although, you know, some people may disagree. Some people think you have agency all the way down, whatever. But I think that's a discussion that needs to be had.
Well, it seems to me that that's a question of if we don't recognize agency in the proper place where it genuinely inheres, it's going to pop up somewhere inappropriate.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, but exactly. We need to be careful. If we're already trying scientist patience and wanting to say, well, recognize agency or at least entertain the idea. Maybe do that in as cautiously and carefully as possible, so that the picture doesn't look too unbelievable. But with regards to evolution, I think that what's happened is that there you have a standard theory, modern synthesis, where there was no room for the organism as an individual, right? So, you know, a lot of people, myself included, have talked about sort of the disappearance of the organism in the 20th century and how it's now sort of finally returning. And the organism disappeared because it was replaced by either suborganismic entities or supraorganismic entities, genes and populations, right? And so the assumption was that we can explain everything we want to explain by either going below the level below the organism or the level above it, right? And the reason why we can look at the level above has to do, I mean, that was already shown in physics in the 19th century with how statistical mechanics, for example, is able to account for properties of gases without looking at what the individual gas molecule is doing. That wonderful recognition that we can identify patterns of order and regularity by looking at large numbers was taken with a vengeance by people like, was really taken seriously with people like Fisher, who developed the mathematical foundations of population genetics, right? So the assumption then was that, that we don't need an organism, right? So that's why the agency is not going to come up, because you're either going to be looking at genes or you're going to be looking at dynamics and changes of allele frequencies in populations, and you're looking at dynamics over time. You know, the lifespan of an organism is irrelevant in evolutionary consideration, so you don't need to think about organisms in that sense. And you're not even interested in the individual organism to begin with. You're interested in patterns and of diversity, say, right, or speciation. There's sort of problems that evolutionary biologists set themselves to address are usually problems that are not pertaining to the individual organism, which I think is why that question of agency just didn't come up. Things started getting more difficult or interesting or complex, depending on your perspective, when people tried to incorporate development into evolution. So, you know, the development of Evo, the recognition that development can help us understand certain evolutionary processes, for example, the emergence of variation, or things like this. And from the 1980s onwards, basically, got a lot more and more people thinking about that intersection of development and evolution, and how what organisms do in their lives can affect conditions that then feed back and affect evolutionary considerations. You know, niche construction being a good example of that, right? Organisms change their niches, they change their environments, and so the selection pressures are a consequence partly of the activities of previous generations of organisms. So you don't have the causal arrow of influence just going from the environment to the gene, not even the organism, to the genes, but rather that it's this kind of reciprocal causation, as it's been called. Some people don't like that term, but it is essentially the idea that you've got a more complex causal picture. Just going back, Samuel, to what you were asking about causation. So new findings in evolutionary biology require us to understand what's going on by not just reducing everything to the action of the environment, right, on organisms or ultimately on genes, but rather understand that organisms do things by virtue of their development, by virtue of their physiology, by virtue of their behavior that then feeds back into evolution. So if you want to understand not just heredity, but also adaptation, right? You're going to have to reckon with what organisms do. And if you do that, Phil, agency is going to come up, right? You're going to have to recognize you can't really change the environment. Well, maybe you can, but some people think that to recognize that is already to recognize that organisms are acting as agents when they do things and they try to solve problems in the ecological context in which they find themselves.
I wonder, Dan, whether another evolutionary sphere in which these new considerations, this new biology that we've talked about, seems to me to be relevant is the issue of evolvability itself, how organisms can evolve in the first place. If they are finely tuned, incredibly finely tuned mechanisms, it's always been, the challenge has always been, how can you change anything without the whole thing, failing? And certainly, how are you ever going to make anything better? There has to be some slack in the system, if you like, that allows organisms to evolve. And it seems that these fuzzier mechanisms, particularly with very complex organisms, are precisely of the sort that you would need to give that slack, to allow evolvability to happen. And this seems to be a discussion that's happening, if not in the mainstream of evolutionary biology, then certainly within, enough embedded in that tradition that it's not necessarily seen as controversial. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And in fact, even here, we find the pervasiveness of machine thinking, right? Both at the level of what selection is, selection as some sort of blind watchmaker, to use Dawkins's term, that acts as an engineer. You got the notion that evolution is acting to optimize organisms to their environment. In a way that is actually quite problematic, that has been recognized as being problematic for a long time. I mean, Jacob has this famous papers, Evolution and Tinkering, talking about how selection proceeds more as a tinkerer than as an engineer. It works with what it has available to it instead of building things from scratch, from the bottom up. And so, and famous critiques, maybe one of the most famous articles in evolutionary biology is the Spandrel's critique of adaptation, the adaptationist program by Gould and Lewontin. You can read that as a critique of the machine view, because what they're saying is it is wrong for you to think that the organism can be split into traits. You can atomize it into traits, and each of these parts of the machine has been designed by evolution to do the best thing, to work in an optimal way. So the recognition of the importance of constraints and limits to the set by development and other considerations is a consideration that organisms are integrated wholes. They're not made up of parts. They're not composite. So you can't try to explain the adaptive history of its parts independently of everything else in the organism. Of course, all biologists know that, but they often haven't taken it very seriously. So even in that context, you find that the recognition of these limits is a recognition of the adequacy of the machine metaphor. Right, so you really see it everywhere you look. Molecular biology, developmental biology, and in evolutionary biology as well. And so discussions about optimality, discussions about the limits of adaptation are also ultimately discussions about how organisms are organized. Right, think about the difference between how a clock, a watchmaker, and a breeder behave when they do things. I mean, remember. Darwin was very aware of Paley's watchmaker analogy. I mean, he had to read that to enter Cambridge. It was part of the examination to be a student at Cambridge. You had to actually read Paley, and so it's kind of interesting that he begins the origin talking about pigeons. Chapter 1 of the Origins. Let me tell you about pigeons. I'm going to tell you about. It's really interesting because the analogy that he's going to draw is not an analogy with how watchmakers work, but how breeders behave, right? That's why he calls it natural selection. That's also a metaphor. It's artificial selection, natural selection. It's a metaphor there too. And the reason is because Darwin understood that there's a fundamental difference between making up, constituting a system by finding the right bits right, that are optimal to do what they do separately and then putting them together, versus, as a breeder does, looking at the properties of the whole system and see how you can cross them to affect the properties of the parts, right? And so, I mean, Darwin, I think, already recognized that the machine view isn't necessarily helpful to understand the process of evolution in a way that then we forgot, with people like Dawkins. I mean, he himself at one point referred to himself as a neo-paleist, as much as a neo-Darwinist, not because, of course, he's atheistic, of course not, he's a atheist, but because the metaphor, the approach is not that different. Paley in his natural theology is trying to explain adaptation and saying, how is it possible that everything is so perfectly adapted to its environment, right? Talking about what you were saying, Phil, before, about how, this idea that everything has to be perfectly adapted, and if that's the case, then we have the trouble of understanding how evolution can happen in the first place. So yeah, discussions of evolvability are pushing against that idea too.
Fantastic. Dan, one thing I want to really try to stress with this new biology project is is why biologists should care, to put it bluntly, in the sense that, I mean, you will no doubt know this as a philosopher of biology, philosophers of physics find the same thing, that practicing biologists or practicing physicists might say, well, that's kind of interesting, but, what does it matter to me working at the lab bench trying to get my cells to do things? I wonder what you might have to say to that about, why should they care about which metaphors we use and whether or not we use the machine metaphor in their daily work? And I guess I'd start that off myself by just pointing out that the more we understand about these systems, actually the more perplexing they become. If I just think of a system like gene regulation, the more we look into it, my God, it becomes, you can start off thinking, well, it's just a load of switches. And then you see at the molecular scale, it's nothing like that. And so I can't help wondering whether changing the way we are thinking about how things ought to work might lead to some understanding. But I wonder how you would respond to that.
When I speak to scientists, I remind myself, or I realize what a luxury it is to be a philosopher, in the sense that you can think about the issues without having to generate data. It's a bit like a food critic. The chef is really busy sweating away, preparing the meal, and you just have come freshly showered, nicely dressed to the restaurant, and you just enjoy the meal. Breathe in the aromas and write about the food. It's a bit similar, I think, the relationship between philosophy of science and science, in the sense that scientists don't have the luxury to just say, well, there's something wrong with machine metaphor, because they have to do their science. So the question that inevitably comes up when I talk to scientists is, okay, how does this help me at the bench? Okay. There's there's a way I can just avoid the answer by just saying, look, division of labor. I'm here to give you ideas. I'm not going to do your work for you, but that's I don't think that's an acceptable way that's not very satisfying. Another way to think about this question is to take seriously the alternatives that become available, because of course, one thing is to say that circuit diagram representations of protein interactions are misleading. Okay. But then how do we represent protein interactions? I mean, that's legitimate work. And I don't have the answers to these questions. I think that also speaks to the dominance of the machine metaphor. It does give us not just the conceptualization, but also a way of describing and talking. And so we give that up, we lose a lot that we feel is necessary to do science. We need ways to talk about what's going on. We need ways to represent what's going on. So if we, so that's just a serious problem. The difficulty to represent phenomena in ways that maybe are more empirically adequate, but less, but do not conform those metaphors is this is a real problem, I think. And I think that look, a lot of things you can say. One is the view that you have is not inevitable. Okay, was the first thing you said, Phil. Okay, is this not you are thinking about this because you've been trained to think about the cell or proteins or development or evolution in this way? You don't have to think. Nature is not telling you to construe it that way. You are choosing to do it that way, and there are other conceptualizations available to you. Okay, so the question then is, can you make these alternative conceptualizations work? can you get them to do the work that you need them to do? Okay. In my work, I've defended processual view of organisms, right? And say, well, you get, so the point there isn't to say give up on metaphor. It's no, you can of course still use metaphors. In fact, still use machine metaphors heuristically in some contexts. Think of something as if it was a machine. So you see when it fails, you learn something about it. To know that the cell is not a machine is to know something about it, namely that it's not a machine. That constitutes knowledge, okay? So, the failure of the metaphor is still a productive, something that we can gain insight from. But then you need to think, well, how can these other alternative metaphors help us make sense of what proteins are doing in a cell, say, if we think of them dynamically? I mean, there's a lot of language now of fluids, because of the interest in biomolecular condensates and cell biology. So you've got all this language now of liquids, and all. It sounds very un-machine-like. Some of it is metaphorical because these are descriptions, as you know, Phil, that apply to at the macroscopic level, and yet you're using it to describe molecules, right? And so the question there is, and I think it's an open question, I don't have the answers, is it's the quest of making them do work for us. Can these generate research programs? If you're using these alternative metaphors, alternative models, how can, what can you learn? And I think that's a problem because, I mean, I say this in one of my papers, if you write a grant application saying, I'm going to show how this protein is able to take 14 different conformations and how everything is really complex, you're unlikely to get funded because you are trying to show how complex things are, right? And so there are a lot of reasons why there's a lot of resistance to giving up on this machine view because it just is so damn useful and irresistible intuitively. It feeds into our intuitions and how we handle the world macroscopically. I mean, I've written about that as well, that we are very comfortable dealing with machines because we do in our everyday life. And so to project that comfort into our understanding of how cells or proteins interact, it seems like a convenient thing to do. But of course, the problem is that the physical scale is totally different. The physical forces that are going to be important at the macroscopic scale, like gravity, are not of no significance on the macroscopic scale. And those that are significant on the macroscopic scale, like Brownian motion, thermal agitation, are important. They're not going to be part of your story if you're projecting from the macroscopic to the microscopic, right? So this is not an answer to your question. As you can see, I don't know how to address this. There are a bunch of issues that we need to sort of, reckon with and try to work together to see whether we can make this practical and useful for scientists. So they don't just say, yeah, interesting, but they can also bring that insight into their labs later.
Well, it may not be an answer to my question, Dan, but I think it's a great encapsulation of what this new biology project is aiming to do. And Samuel, I want to hand back to you now because it seems to me that is exactly the discussion, the kind of discussion we want to have. How can, what are the new narratives? What are the new metaphors and how can they be made useful?
Yeah, exactly, Phil. I agree. I think maybe just in the last 10 minutes, I'd love to push you and Dan to think about that because it seems to me sort of one of the major storylines here is a story about an inadequate idea of causality. That, like you're pointing out, Dan, there's an incredible irresistibility to the machine metaphor and the mechanistic paradigm in spite of its inadequacy. And you've argued very clearly, like Phil, that ontologically, life is not a machine. Even if it's useful heuristically to think, well, what if life were like a machine? So I think one of the ways that potentially could become useful to scientists is I'm thinking of our first conversation with Paul Nurse. Nurse stressed when, Phil, you asked him about purpose. I think it'd be good to end talking about purpose because my hypothesis, Dan, would be, would you agree that if scientists were not afraid of the concept of purpose, that itself would allow a lot of alternate frameworks that are kind of already available, but as you pointed out, for sociological and pragmatic and professional reasons, they're not feasible for many scientists. But Nurse said, yeah, absolutely. He says you have to understand life as an organization of space and time as a whole for a purpose. He stressed that. He said that was based on his work that won the Nobel, that this ability, the exact thing you mentioned in your article, that there's a deep sensitivity to time, a deep sensitivity to space. Somehow life is organizing space and time. It's managing information dynamically. And you can't account for that kind of causal real whole without the idea of a purpose. So I guess I would love for both you and Phil to maybe talk about, if the idea of purpose is essential, as I know you both argue it is. Dan, you mentioned in your work 4 attributes of an organism, right? Partly it's these self-referencing abilities. It's self-organized. So could you talk about what about the role of purpose? If purpose were sort of destigmatized, it weren't associated with vitalism, would that help? Would we then just get a much more open way of thinking about science, that biologists then wouldn't need to be worried if I use this word, someone's going to think I'm a creationist or, an intelligent design theorist?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. I mean, my first paper on this, just called Organisms, Not Machines, is the argument I give there is based on purpose. So I say, the difference between organisms and machines is a distinction of purposiveness. Organisms are intrinsically purposive, machines are extrinsically purposive. What does that mean? Well, machines do what they do by virtue of having been programmed or designed to do what they do. Your toaster heats your bread in the morning for you because you're going to benefit. You're going to benefit from the action of the machine, right? If the toaster malfunctions, then you are the one that determines that it's malfunctioning because you are the one that is benefiting from its operation, right? So the language of function there is relevant as well. How we talk about, function language, why it is that we use function language in certain sciences and not in others, has to do with that as well. Whereas in the case of the organism, right, an organism is acting on its own behalf. It has to do what it needs to do certain things to stay in existence, right? And so you can understand everything that the organism does ultimately as fulfilling that purpose of self-maintenance, right? And I think the key to making this palatable is to ground it in organization, in physics, in whatever it is that we can use to make this scientific, right? And there have been a lot of interesting work in theoretical biology that's trying to do exactly that, to explain if you have self-organization, you have intrinsic purposiveness. It's not some spooky mystical thing that you're adding there to the cocktail. It's just it's something that it derives from the organizational dynamics of the system, right? So if you're prepared to accept the organizational part of the story of what a cell is, say, then you should be in principle prepared to accept that what falls out of that is the ability of that system to be intrinsically purposive. And if you accept that, then that you can already draw on that. So I think that might be one way to go.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's very much my view as well, to naturalize the idea, because, there's a long tradition. I mean, even people like Monod, recognized that living organisms have to be seen as things that have goals. I think that there's saying that much isn't, I don't think, necessarily going to generate much pushback in biology. I guess the narrative that seems to have arisen is, well, yeah, but that's just another way of talking about evolution. Those goals are just set by evolution. And the common answer will be, those goals are basically for the organism to survive and to reproduce. And so we can think of those goals as being ones that are about the genes and the survival of the genes. So that's a narrative you can develop. Doesn't actually tell us very much about what organisms will do in any particular circumstance. It's not obvious to us sitting here. What should I best do right now in order to survive and propagate and, spread my genes? That doesn't answer any questions about the behavior of organisms. And I don't just mean the, what it chooses to do. I mean the way that the tissues and the cells themselves are working. So it seems to me to be both a sort of, a kind of a valid response from an evolutionary, population biology point of view, and also a silent one. It tells us very little about the nature of the organism and how it chooses to do what it does. So what we really need is a better understanding of how organisms create goals, make decisions. And there's nothing mystical about that. There doesn't have to be any sense that the organism is somehow doing that with self-awareness and with reflection. I mean, some organisms can, but not all organisms, I think, can meaningfully be thought of making decisions in that way. But I do think that it can be naturalized. And this is something that's happening in the human context within neuroscience. The whole schools of research about the decision-making machinery, or if we can call it that, decision-making circuitry in our brains, but it's something that pertains to biology as a whole. So I think it's exactly that we just have to take away the anxiety that exists around this notion of purpose, but also to free it from this kind of constraining view that, oh, we can push all of that onto evolution and say, well, it's just about genes propagating, which, in the end doesn't tell us very much at all.
Yeah, I mean, the other, of course, alternative that was given by Monod, actually, and Ernst Mayr, is to talk about teleonomy instead of teleology, right? Which is which, of course, was in the way that Mayr used it, is to describe the operation of the genetic program. So there you don't have a reduction to that evolution explains it all, but that the machine metaphor explains it. Okay, in the same way that computers do things for us, and they are programmed to behave in a particular way. That's the only notion of purpose that you need in biology. Ernst Mayr made that case famously in 1961 when he introduced the notion of a genetic program. He said, "Well, this solves the problem of teleology, people. I'm going to call it teleonomy now, and this is like scientific in the same way that astrology is not scientific, but astronomy is." Teleonomy is how we should describe the ability of organisms to to behave purposively as a product of running that genetic program. You see, so that's not a very satisfying answer, right? Either, right? Because if the genetic program model of development is wrong, and I think increasingly it's becoming apparent that it is wrong, and maybe not just wrong, but it can't be salvaged, it can't be, tinkered with, then the whole picture of teleology that had been built off that by people like Monod and Mayr also fails. And we need, as you put it, Phil, a kind of a different way of thinking about it, that this reduces to evolution nor to information or cybernetics.
Yeah. I mean, it also makes no logical sense when you think about it that there is no way that the genome can somehow program any reasonably complex organism to know what decision it must make in every circumstance that it's going to encounter in its life, every day of which is going to be different. It simply cannot work that way. So there has to be some other way by which genuine agency arises within the organism. Yeah.
So to close this off, a big question then, Phil, you and I have talked, is this a paradigm shift? And Dan, I was struck when you mentioned if you drop out of the mechanistic metaphor, a bunch of problems then cease to be problems. And that's exactly what Kuhn said is the mark of a shift from one paradigm. Is he said a new paradigm must successfully make what appears an anomaly appear expected.
Right.
And so do you think that part of the big resistance here is there's a kind of clear story? We need a more coordinated sense of causality where agency is linked to purpose at the level of individual organisms, not just being referred to at the evolutionary level, working down to the genetic level inside of the cell. But the reason the resistance to that is so deep is it because this is an actual very large scale shift, what Kuhn would call a paradigm shift, which he pointed out there's a lot of resistance to that. And if so, I guess, do you think that we're close to that tipping, Phil? I'd be curious if you want to start or end on this. I've been talking about this for a year, but Dan, as a philosopher of science and biology particularly, I'm curious if you think, this is a really kind of huge paradigm shift, going back to the beginning of the framing, that the mechanistic paradigm hasn't been the only paradigm, but it's been the dominant paradigm, not just since evolution, but since Descartes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my philosopher or science colleagues will hate me if I say anything good about Kuhn because
I know I put you in a bad spot. I'm sorry.
We all teach it. I mean, when you teach philosophy, you teach Kuhn, but it has sort of not gone out of favor in terms of a model to understand concrete scientific examples, and I think not completely in a justified way, because as you point out, Samuel, it is helpful to think and I think we all sort of secretly draw on not just Kuhn but Lakatos and other people who thought about scientific change in this grandiose way that historians hate, because historians think everything is local and specific and you can't generalize, and philosophers also think it's not very sophisticated to refer to Kuhn or paradigms. But I think setting those sort of anxieties aside, it really is really striking, as you point out, that much of what's going on can be described quite effectively using this Kuhnian language, right? Of these anomalies that can't be resolved, and how when the shift is towards a completely different way of thinking, not an extension of the existing view, one that forces you to think about things in a totally different way, and where suddenly that which was super strange and weird becomes expected and becomes natural. And I think there's a lot of, I think that's not quite right. But But if you look at the literature, every now and then, every generation, maybe every decade, you see a couple of papers published on the coming Kuhnian revolution in biology, which never comes, right? There's one paper just titled that, "The Coming Revolution in Biology," from 1998, I think. So yeah, well, I think we need to be very cautious about expressing these things in these grandiose terms. Maybe only the historians of the future will have that luxury to look back to our present time and say, yes, there was a paradigm shift going on. But from our present context, I think it's undeniable that, I mean, one of the papers that I wrote on this was essentially a paper written in that way. Like, you got one view and you got another view, and these are alternative views of the same phenomena, right? Gene expression, is it programmed? Is it stochastic? Cellular architecture, is it self-assembled? Is it self-organizing? Protein complexes, are they molecular machines, or are they pleomorphic ensembles? So I think it's valuable and useful to draw on these ideas, as long as we don't let ourselves get carried away by them. I don't think that you're going to convince many scientists necessarily by making that case. But I mean, that is what excites me. I don't know about you both, but I mean, what I find very exciting about being a philosopher of biology in 2025 is to be able to witness this as it's happening. Where there is the beginning of crumbling, the cracks of beginning to show on a view that has been extremely successful and productive for 75 years, and we're witnessing that sort of period of what Kuhn will call a crisis, right? Where we're sort of beginning to question things, which is exactly what's happening, by the way, because Kuhn says to be a good scientist is you don't question the paradigm. When people start losing confidence in the paradigm, that's when they start asking these questions. And that's exactly what we've done today, ask these questions that we weren't previously asking about, is the organism really a machine? Is the cell really a machine? So the very fact that we're asking those questions, I think, testifies that there's some truth in how Kuhn thought about scientific change.
Thanks.
Yeah. I would agree with that absolutely. That I think it's only going to be in retrospect that we can evaluate how big, how profound a change this is. But I do think, I mean, as Dan says, the questions we're talking about wouldn't really have been talked about 20 or 30 years ago. And from my point of view, I think part of that change is because we have a different conception now of how things are working. We know about all this sort of non-coding information in the genome. We know about the complexity, the much greater complexity of regulation and the centrality of regulation in our systems. We know that there are disordered proteins that defy the standard paradigm. We know that there are these condensates that seem like very loose, globules, rather than the very precise structures that we used to think govern things in biology. So I think these conversations are being actually forced, at one level at least. They're being forced by what is actually coming out of the most reductive aspect of biology, molecular biology. And that, to me, is the really striking thing about it.
Well, thank you, Phil and Dan, for taking on a big question. I know it's a tough thing. The bias to me is real, but my impression was when I read Phil's book and then I saw the scientific literature he was interacting with, it made me reconsider Kuhn. I'd say an empiricist reading of Kuhn, which is, I think most philosophers of science are not actually involved often directly, like the way, Phil, you are, in, you could say, bridging scientific research in a number of fields: chemistry, biology, physics, writing peer-reviewed articles, also writing about science. And reading your work, I thought, wow, actually, Kuhn seems weirdly to be empirically relevant to this process.
Am I going to rehabilitate Kuhn?
No, I won't put that on you. There's no blame on that. It could just be the framing of the person who has to organize the project. But I appreciate especially that both of you have been able to bring such specialized care and clarity, avoiding, as you said, Dan, the big grandiose claims, and yet recognizing maybe in retrospect that will be something like what we're going through, because to give life its due is a big challenge to the mechanistic paradigm. And I think you both laid that out very brilliantly and beautifully today, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you both.
Oh, pleasure.
Real pleasure.
Thank you.
Enjoyable.